strained ties between India and Canada, Justin Trudeau is facing intense scrutiny for multiple quarters, even as India continues its crackdown on Khalistani terrorists operating from foreign soil. Now, the Indian government has directed the investigating agencies to identify and seize properties of Khalistani terrorists both within the nation and abroad. Now, the Indian government has now made its stand extremely clear that it will no longer tolerate anyone linked to the Khalistani movement and that India is ready to move mountains to revoke the overseas citizenship of these Khalistanis. Meanwhile, the Baloch Human Rights Council of Canada has questioned the inaction by the Trudeau government against Pakistan when Karima Baloch, a vocal critic of the Pakistan army and against the Pakistan government's atrocities in Balochistan, was found dead in Canada's Toronto City in 2020. The Baloch body also questioned the promptness by which the Canadian authorities have taken up Nijjar's killing against the Indian government. But all in all, where do things stand as of now between the nations? What are the implications about the current situation as well? Let me take that question across to my guests who are joining me this evening. Manjeet Puri, former ambassador, and Major General Dhruv Katoch, Director, India Foundation. Good evening to the both of you. Thank you very much for taking the time out and joining us here on Mirror Now. Mr. Puri, let me come to you first. Just talking about this entire situation, India has clearly tightened its noose by taking this step. How do you view this?
Niwedhana, thank you very much. I am completely with the actions that we've taken. In fact, I would say that, these were actions that should have been taken a long time back. There can be no space for terrorism, at least not as far as India is concerned. And, this Khalistan business, who in India is anything to do with this? And I believe even in Canada, there are a small, minuscule minority who, or not even a minority, just a handful of people who sort of use this for whatever personal reasons, etc. And therefore, the stance that we've taken, and more than that, the actions that we are taking are absolutely in accordance with our law, and I believe are absolutely in keeping with all countries would do with so-called secessionists, etc., whether they are within your country or if they are overseas. Now, you mentioned something very interesting, that Prime Minister Trudeau is also being questioned back home. Now, we all sort of tend to believe that Canada is this great liberal parliamentary democracy. Well, fine. Then he better answer all these particular allegations that he has leveled at India for his own people and let the world know what does he have or what is it that he doesn't have, so that the matters are clear and there's no finger pointing without there being, let me say, absolutely cast iron evidence, especially given the fact of India's democratic credentials, our friendship with Canada, long-standing friendship, and the kind of bilateral relations and people's links that we have with that country.
Absolutely, Mr. Puri. In fact, we'll talk about that as well as to how it impacts the ties between both these nations. But let me go across to Major General Katoch. Sir, thank you very much for also joining us here this evening. In your opinion, geopolitically speaking, what does this mean?
I think as far as India and Canada is concerned, the relations are on a downslide, and I don't see them improving. But when we are looking at the geopolitics of the entire situation, you will find that Canada's allies, the US, Britain, Australia, they really won't be siding with New Zealand, the Five Eyes as we call them. They will not really be siding with New Zealand, with Canada on this particular issue. And that is where Canada has a problem. They were expecting downright support, and that support which they're getting is muted. But more importantly, within Canada itself, Trudeau is facing a very, very rough time. And as per polls, and as per pollsters, if a poll is to be held today, he will lose. That is one aspect of it. I also want to talk about India a little bit. You see, I think there were toolkits operating for this year, 2023, which was supposed to be activated towards the middle and the end of the year. I think the government has done a very good job in utilizing some of these, including this Khalsa movement, which the neutralization started quite some time back, and now it is taking up full speed. While I agree with Ambassador Puri that there are not too many Sikhs who support the Khalsa movement. The problem is the small minority has guns, and those guns actually dictate to the larger majority not to support the movement, but at least to keep quiet. That is what is happening in Canada. The particular killing of Nijjar, in my view, has got nothing to do with the government of India. I think it is an inter-rival gang killing. They routinely take place to take control of the Gurdwara funds, and there are two reasons for it. One, if it had to be a state-sponsored event, it would have been a totally black operation. People won't have known something has happened. That is one. Secondly, it is very easy, instead of getting directly involved, to promote somebody to carry out such operations. In my view, the Indian government will never get its hand dirty on an operation like this, which is why Mr. Trudeau does not have any proof.
Right, and he also finds himself in a very sticky situation. But taking a few points from what you did say, Major General Katoch, let me take that across to Ambassador Puri as well. Mr. Puri, as we speak about, of course, the opening remarks that Major General Katoch has also made, if I were to come back to you on the fact that how you were talking about the implications of India and Canada's ties, because the opening remark that Mr. Katoch also did make was with the fact that this relationship will now see a downhill. Is that how you view it as well?
Niwedhana, at the moment, given the state of tension, it can hardly be expected that matters will be dialed back very soon. So, when you start this particular thing, you open a Pandora's box and a downward trend becomes very easy to follow and go through. And I completely agree with General Saab that, this is what you're going to see. I sincerely hope and believe that while this is what you're going to see in the rhetoric for several weeks and maybe even longer, I hope that, there are, let me say, saner and more and voices, as well as those with a degree of being able to talk in Canada in particular, to be able to somehow bring this particular matter to a bit of a dial down matter. I mean, this is important. These are two major countries in the world. We have similarities of interests of various kinds. The G20 relationship, the fact that Indo-Pacific is a very important element. So, this kind of an action taken by the Prime Minister of Canada, finger pointing at a huge democracy, a country with major relationships that you have, is something which is not part of what we call the rule-based play of diplomacy and diplomatic order, and certainly needs to be dialed down by them on their side in particular. That's important. It will take time. There's no doubt about that.
All right, Mr. Puri, as you draw things into perspective for us as well, going back to Major General Katoch, the other aspect over here being how, the Baloch groups have been slamming Trudeau. What they're also talking about, how selectively, you're talking about atrocities. And on the other hand, when we're talking about a specific episode of involving Karima Baloch, who was a vocal critic of Pakistan Army against the Pakistan government's atrocities in Balochistan, beg your pardon. She, in fact, was found dead in Canada in 2020. Major General, if you would to, analyze this situation for us as well, as far as selective outrage is concerned.
As far as the murder or the assassination of Karima Baloch is concerned, there was a very clear Pakistani ISI hand involved. And despite that, the Canadian police refused to recognize it. They have, for some strange reason, a very soft corner for Pakistan. And I suspect it is because Pakistan and Canada both operate in tandem as far as Khalistani terrorists are concerned. The ISI, to some extent, has been given a reasonably free hand in Canada to eliminate those people living in Canada who are opponents of the Pakistani regime. Now, had they taken this up, the fingerprints point very, very clearly to the ISI, and I'm afraid it was not done. Even when the murder took place, there was huge discussions taking place here that we need to do something about it. but the Canadian government refused to act. It is this policy of certain Western democracies of acting against terrorism based on convenience, which is the cause of terrorism still flourishing in this world. So, unless there is a complete change of attitude, I'm afraid terrorism will continue in some form or the other.
All right, taking that point back to you, Mr. Puri, is that how you view it as well, that acting against terrorism has been very selective, even if we talk about this episode for that matter?
Niwedhana, I think this is a truism. Did the world know the word terrorism before 9/11? And you are a very young lady, but remember 1993 in Mumbai, the horrendous terrorist attacks. So we have been talking about this right throughout, but I'm afraid the Western world, which thinks that, the world is theirs and they are the ones who lay down the paradigms, only when things impact them do they react. Now, you've been mentioning this Baloch incident. Look, double standards, we all know double standards exist. But if you want to play double standards, that I'm afraid, then, this particular call comes back to call on you too. And so Prime Minister Trudeau finds himself on a sticky wicket on both sides of the fence.
All right, Mr. Puri, and before we wrap up, what I would want to understand from you is, how do you see this pan out in terms of the stance for India, along with the Five Eyes, including other nations as well?
Niwedhana, look, there is no doubt that Prime Minister Trudeau, by coming out in the public in his parliament and finger pointing at a democracy which is part of this Indo-Pacific strategy and therefore the China angle, given the size of the Indian economy, us being one of the few global sweet spots in the world economy, building US relationships, etc. Canadian action has really put the spot on the Five Eyes. There's no doubt, or rather the Four Eyes, the fifth being the Canadians. It has put them in a spot. It has made things extremely difficult for them. And frankly speaking, I am at a complete loss of words. Why the Prime Minister of Canada should have acted completely outside the acknowledged and accepted rule book, even in extremely serious sets of cases and cases where you may think that you have a case. After all, if you thought that X or Y was responsible, you had the entire law enforcement route. You make a case, you put out a red corner notice, you may issue summons, you can do all that. And in terms of reaching out to governments, there are all the methodologies available. You just don't stand up in your parliament and finger point at a country like India, which is the world's largest democracy.
All right, Mr. Puri, as you make those closing remarks, let me also get in a quick word from Major General retired Dhruv Katoch. Mr. Katoch, before we wrap up the show, the same question being posed to you as well. So in your opinion, how do you see this pan out?
Well, I think it'll take a little bit of time for relationship between India and Canada to stabilize. I don't see it happening in the immediate future, but that depends a large deal on how Mr. Trudeau behaves. But on the positive side, I'm glad that the government of India is now taking very strict action against these elements in India itself. We are no longer a soft state, and unless this evil is curbed in the bud, it will come to haunt us repeatedly. So I'm very glad that these steps are being taken by the government of India, and hopefully, once this problem is over, at least in India, there will be peace.
All right. On that note, I want to thank you, Major General Katoch, as well as Mr. Puri, for taking the time out and joining us here on Niwedhana. Really appreciate you taking out the time out and also drawing things into perspective for our viewers. But we're going to leave the conversation at that and shift our focus to the other.